Hi friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 19 of our read along together of Emma by Jane Austen. Today we are so close to the end. We've just got 5 more days of reading. Yay! And as you probably saw, I've been posting lots of things into our thread. Hello, good to see you. Let's see, the big one is that we are about to finish reading Emma, and so as I discussed before, there's a lot of great film adaptations, and so we are going to screen Emma, the 2020 version of it, on Saturday the 13th. And the way it worked out is that you have options. You can watch it anytime between 3 p.m. and midnight. You need to use a special passcode, and the way to get it is if you go to the San Diego Public Library's online events calendar and register that you want to attend that screening, then you'll get sent the codes. And so you can do that. The other thing you can do, though, is if you want to watch it sort of together as we can, is that I'm actually going to live stream a little sort of something like this, like just talking about stuff at 2:45 on that Saturday. And I'm going to show off my little tea set, see what I have as snacks. I don't know if I could do I don't even know what I'm going to do, like maybe scones, maybe popcorn, maybe Raisinets. What should we watch? What should we eat for this movie screening that we're doing? But it's tea time, so should it be more tea stuff or movie stuff? Oh, I don't know. So we can all show off what we've got for our snacks and our drinks if we'd like to, and we can talk about the film. So if you want to join me for that, that's going to be 2:45 on Saturday the 13th. And then if you want to, we can all basically count down 3, 2, 1, boom, and then all hit go at the same time and comment along together in the thread as we want, if we want to sort of watch it together and comment. Or you can just watch it on your own whenever it's convenient for you between 3 and midnight. So that's the first thing. Then the other part of that too is that to conclude our read along together of Emma, just as we always do, we're going to have a tea party, a special one on Monday the 15th. But because it'll have just followed the film, we can also talk about the film as well if you've had a chance to watch that. So that'll be fun. That'll be on Monday the 15th. Finally, since we're coming to all this stuff, wrapping up all of what we've, our stuff with Emma, that means that we get to start thinking ahead to what we want to read next. Yay! And so I started a thread today, and I am so happy. I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, I started out with 2 little suggestions, and there's already 7, so that makes me so thrilled that you guys are suggesting books that you want to read. Please go in and nominate books from the public domain that you would be interested in reading together in our tea group. Or if you don't have something in particular that you're burning to read together, look at the list and see what's been nominated so you can at least have a voice in helping to choose what we'll read next. So that poll is open in our Facebook tea group. It'll be open through next Tuesday at 3 o'clock, at which point I'll announce what we'll read after we conclude Emma. All right, so I think that is all of our housekeeping. I've done a ton of talking. That means it's time for tea. Today's tea that I'm enjoying, I still have a lot of the holiday teas left over. We're getting into March, so now I'm starting to feel a bit embarrassed that I'm still drinking my Christmassy teas, but they're delicious. And so I'm still drinking some of the Nutcracker Sweet. It's a black tea blend from Celestial Seasonings. I gotta say, Celestial Seasonings, I am not thrilled with their description of this one, with their ingredients. They just say black tea, natural vanilla flavor with other natural flavors and cinnamon. I like it better when they tell us exactly what it is, so you can just get a feel like, oh, that's what makes that wonderful smell. I don't know what's making that wonderful smell. I think vanilla is part of it, but I feel like there's something they're not naming. They're keeping it a secret from me, but whatever it is delicious. I hope you all have something good today too. All right, let's talk about yesterday's readings. As I mentioned, yesterday had one of my least favorite chapters, not because it was poorly written, not because it didn't advance the plot, but just because I felt so bad for Emma and for poor Miss Bates. Okay, let's go in and talk though about what we read. Yesterday we read 2 chapters, chapters 42 and 43 of our full book, or chapters 7 and 8 of volume 3. In 6 and 7 of volume 3. I was like, something's not right. In chapter 6, it started out basically with them saying how Mrs. Elton had been talking about her brother-in-law and her sister, the Sucklings, were going to come visit, and it was going to be amazing and grand, and these folks from Maple Grove. So it was going to be wonderful and like the social event, right? But they decided to postpone their trip to the fall until I believe August it was. And so the trip that she had planned to go visit Box Hill, a little place in the country, has been postponed. And Emma, meanwhile, had been planning a separate trip to Box Hill with her circle of friends, the Westons and probably Mr. Knightley and Harriet. And Mr. Weston basically said, well, why don't we combine the two trips? Why don't we the two groups, why don't we all go together to Box Hill? And Emma didn't want to say, well, why not do it? Because I hate Mrs. Elton. I don't like her. She didn't want to say that, so she said, like, gritted her teeth basically and said, fine, let's go ahead and all go together to Box Hill. And so so they made plans to go to Box Hill. Meanwhile, there was a problem with something going on. You know, there was some delays, and Mrs. Elton was complaining about to Knightley, because she doesn't call him Mr. Knightley as everyone else does. She just calls him Knightley in an overly familiar manner. Oof. And so she was complaining to Knightley about the delay in the trip to Box Hill, and he said, well, why bother going there? Why don't you just come to Donwell instead? We have these wonderful strawberries that everyone likes to pick. And she takes him up on the offer. She thinks he's serious, and she's like, of course we'll come do it. It'll be a wonderful little outing. It'll be fabulous. I'll bring my cute basket. And he's just like, oh my God. And she's like, I'll arrange the whole thing. He's like, no, you won't. And it's great too. At one point he says, there's only one married woman whom I would ever allow to invite whatever guest she pleases, and that woman is the future Mrs. Knightley. Until she is here, I will do these things myself. And so Mr. Knightley is very set in what he wants, and that he will not be swayed or controlled by Mrs. Elton. And so they end up having 2 consecutive days of outings. There's a day where the group all goes to Mr. Knightley's home, Donwell Abbey. They pick the strawberries, they're exploring, and then the following day they go to Box Hill. And things just go a little wonky during these 2 visits. On the first visit to Donwell Abbey, there is, let's see, I'm getting my days mixed up, so I want to be sure to say, Mrs. Elton and her husband is sort of separated off from Emma and the Westons, and then Mr. Knightley is with the Miss Fairfax and the Bateses, and so it's like these groups are all separate, and so it just doesn't feel like the convivial thing that they had hoped it to be. There is a moment too where Jane Fairfax is very distressed, and she says, you know, I just can't be here anymore. And Emma thinks it's because of how Mrs. Elton has been pestering Jane Fairfax about how, you know, she's going to, find her a job and all this stuff. And Jane Fairfax is like, no, please stop. I've asked you not to. But, you know, Jane Fairfax says, I just need to go home. I just want to be alone. Thank you, but no thank you. I don't want the offer of the carriage. I really just want to be alone. And Emma is feeling kind of bad for her, and she even speculates, like, I pity you, you know, such a home indeed, such an aunt. And so she's thinking it's not just Mrs. Elton, but also Miss Bates that is getting on Jane Fairfax's nerves. And so Jane leaves, and then shortly after, Mr. Frank Churchill shows up. He was late for the picnic at Donwell Abbey, and he alludes to having met Jane along the way, but he's in a cranky mood when he comes in to see Emma, and he's all just like, well, I don't know why I bothered to come out here. You know, I should have stayed with my aunt in Richmond, and it's like I came out here and it's hot, and I'm gonna have to go right back. And he's a cranky puss. And so Emma basically says, look, maybe you need to eat something. You're a little hangry, and then also maybe you need to come tomorrow with us to Box Hill. And so he eventually says that he will go the next day to Box Hill. So the whole group gets together again, and they go to Box Hill, and it's horrible. Emma is bored. She feels like it's dull. Frank Churchill is in a bad, cranky mood too. He is silent and stupid, as she puts it. And eventually, though, when they all sit down near each other, so they're all in hearing of each other, he suddenly gets like almost manically gay, and he's just like trying to tease her and cajole her and trying to like be friendly and entertaining, and it's too much. And it looks to everyone else, she is sure, as if the two of them are flirting with each other. And even though she is not romantically interested in him at all, and she believes he is no longer interested in her, she can't help but to be playful back with him, because it's just so quiet and dull otherwise. And so she's laughing and playing with him, but she is not meaning it in a romantic way at all. But she does recognize that the other observers might think that that's what's happening. So, a little uncomfortable. He then tries to, again, lighten the mood and says, like, well, I'm going to announce that on behalf of Miss Woodhouse, who is like basically the queen of the party, I'm she demands that you each say something interesting to amuse her. And Mrs. Elton goes into a whole thing of like, well, she thinks she's the queen of the party. I would never be so presumptuous, you know, but of course, you know, and I would never presume to ask people what they think, and I would never presume all this stuff. And she's basically picking on Emma for what Frank Churchill is saying that Emma wants. They revise it a little bit, and so where Mr. Churchill says, instead, they're asking that people either say one thing clever, two things moderately clever, or three things very dull. And here's where it gets, I thought, sad, is that Miss Bates starts talking, going like, oh, I can do that. I can say dull things all day long. I bet I can say a couple dull things. I would be so worried about saying something clever. She's going on and on and on. And Emma, gently, but perhaps not as kindly as she could, looks around and says, but the difficulty is to only say only three dull things. And when Miss Bates understands that Emma is chiding her for being too dull and for being too talkative and saying dull things, she's shamed, and she's publicly shamed, and it's uncomfortable. The afternoon progresses. There's an interesting bit too where Frank Churchill says something about how the two Eltons seem so well suited for each other, both that they're both rather hateful people, it turns out, and that they knew each other so little in Bath, but they were affianced and now wed, and they are so suited for each other, and it's so difficult to get to know somebody in those kind of social situations and to make a life decision like that, to be married, when you know them really intimately so little. And it's only you get to know them better when you see them in their home environment, like around their friends and their family. And Jane Fairfax has a few things to say to that too, but then it gets cut off, and they're all a little, things are just awkward and a little weird. He ends by telling Emma that he would like her to find him a wife someday, because clearly it's a hard thing to do and he's not equipped to do it himself. As they're getting ready to leave, Emma finds herself near Mr. Knightley, and he tells her bluntly, I care about you, and I'm going to tell you something that's not nice, but it's true. What you did was wrong. You were insulting to Miss Bates. And she's like, well, but she is rather ridiculous. And he's like, she is. But she's also an older woman, and she's poor. And the fact, like, if she was a social equal, you could take the piss out of her. You could pick on her a little bit. You can have that interplay. But you're not. I mean, you are her social superior. You have a lot more money. You have a lot more privilege. And this woman who had raised you up in some ways, like she had known Emma since she was a child, and I love this line too, where he says, you whom she had known from an infant, whom she had seen grow up from a period when her notice was an honor, to have you now in thoughtless spirits and the pride of the moment, laugh at her, humble her, and before her niece too, and before others, many of whom would be guided by your treatment of her. It broke my heart, that line, because, I mean, you can see this thing of like this woman who had seen Emma as this sweet little child, a contemporary of her niece, and just somebody who Emma must have looked up to as a child. I mean, not recognizing the differences of social class, but just that this was a woman who was her father's friend. This was a woman who she respected so much that she would just think it was, just that she had this moment of trying to make a little joke, and it was not kindly meant. It was a little mean-spirited. I mean, she may have tried to tell herself it wasn't, but she was making a joke at Miss Bates's expense. And I don't know. I find that it's just a little sad to read, because even though we know Emma is not blameless, not nearly as blameless as her father, or as faultless as her father likes to say, or as even Mr. Weston said in this chapter, that the letters that signify perfection are M and A because they stand for Emma. We know she's not perfect, but the fact that she did something that was so hurtful to somebody as innocuous, yes, annoying, but gentle and well-meant as Miss Bates was just a little heartbreaking. And so what we find at this chapter is that Emma hears the words of Mr. Knightley, and she isn't able to respond to him. And it ends with him leaving her, and she realizes after he stepped away that he might think that she's angry. He might think that she's in denial, but instead her heart is breaking. I mean, she's so angry at herself for realizing what she's done, how wrong she's been, that she didn't get a chance to tell him that she recognized her error and that she was sorry and she'd do better. Instead, he went away thinking that she didn't care. And so she spends the rest of the carriage ride in silence with Harriet, weeping with tears falling down her face unchecked. Oh, it's such a sad chapter. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I can only see half of the comment that's up on my phone right now, and I'm afraid to move it around. So I can see Pam's comment that, she didn't recall what Emma had said that was so mean. It wasn't terribly like trying to be mean, but it was just like, it was something that called Miss Bates, called attention to Miss Bates's habit to ramble and to be perhaps more dull than she'd like. And just, this woman who she's frequently described as being complete goodness, and that she is, somebody who, yeah, it was just a sad thing that Emma realized that she had, there we go. I think it's like To Kill a Mockingbird. They just sing, they try to do something beautiful and nice, and Emma did something hurtful to something that was gentle. So there you go. So yeah, I find that to be one of the harder chapters, because it makes me feel so bad for Emma not living up to her own expectations of who she can be, and just realizing she has failed herself and failed somebody she cares about very much, both in hurting Miss Bates and in hurting the good opinion of Mr. Knightley, whom she also values a lot. So it's a hard chapter. But that said, we're past it now. The tears have dried off Emma's face, and let's wipe them away figuratively. Let's go to our next chapters. Today we have 3 chapters, and let's go ahead and read together chapters 8 through 10 of volume 3, or chapters 44 through 46 of our book. The wretchedness of a scheme to Box Hill was in Emma's thoughts all the evening. How it might be considered by the rest of the party, she could not tell. They, in their different homes and their different ways, might be looking back on it with pleasure. But in her view, it was a morning more completely misspent, more totally bare of rational satisfaction at the time, and more to be abhorred in recollection than any she had ever passed. A whole evening of backgammon with her father was felicity to it. There, indeed, lay real pleasure, for there she was giving up the sweetest hours of the 24 to his comfort, and feeling that, unmerited as might be the degree of his fond affection and confiding esteem, she could not, in her general conduct, be open to any severe reproach. As a daughter, she hoped she was not without a heart. She hoped no one could have said to her, "How could you be so unfeeling to your father?" I will tell you truths while I can. Miss Bates should never again, no, never. If attention in future could do away the past, she might hope to be forgiven. She had been often remiss, her conscience told her so. Remiss perhaps more in thought than fact, scornful, ungracious, but it should be so no more. In the warmth of true contrition, she would call upon her the very next morning, and it should be the beginning, on her side, of a regular, equal, kindly intercourse. She was just as determined when the morrow came, and went early, that nothing might prevent her. It was not unlikely, she thought, that she might see Mr. Knightley in her way, or perhaps he might come in while she were paying her visit. She had no objection. She would not be ashamed of the appearance of the penitence, so justly and truly hers. Her eyes were towards Donwell as she walked, but she saw him not. The ladies were all at home. She had never rejoiced at the sound before, nor ever before entered the passage, nor walked up the stairs with any wish of giving pleasure, but in conferring obligation or of deriving it, except in subsequent ridicule. There was a bustle on her approach, a good deal of moving and talking. She heard Miss Bates's voice. Something was to be done in a hurry. The maid looked frightened and awkward, hoped she would be pleased to wait a moment, and then ushered her in too soon. The aunt and niece seemed both escaping into the adjoining room. Jane she had a distinct glimpse of, looking extremely ill, and before the door had shut them out, she heard Miss Bates saying, "Well, my dear, I shall say you are laid down upon the bed, and I am sure you are ill enough." Poor old Mrs. Bates, civil and humble as usual, looked as if she did not quite understand what was going on. "I am afraid Jane is not very well," said she, "but I do not know. They tell me she is well. I dare say my daughter will be here presently, Miss Woodhouse. I hope you find a chair. I wish Hetty had not gone. I am very little able." "Have you a chair, ma'am? Do you sit where you like? I am sure she will be here presently." Emma seriously hoped she would. She had a moment's fear of Miss Bates keeping away from her, but Miss Bates soon came, "Very happy and obliged." But but Emma's conscience told her that there was not the same cheerful volubility as before, less ease of look and manner. A very friendly inquiry after Miss Fairfax, she hoped, might lead the way to a return of old feelings. The touch seemed immediate. "Ah, Miss Woodhouse, how kind you are! I suppose you have heard, and are come to give us joy. This does not seem much like joy, indeed, in me," twinkling away a tear or two, "but it will be very trying for us to part with her after having had her so long, and she has a dreadful headache just now, riding all the morning. Such long letters, you know, to be written to Colonel Campbell and Mrs. Dixon. 'My dear,' said I, 'you will blind yourself,' for tears were in her eyes perpetually. One cannot wonder, one cannot wonder. It is a great change, and though she is amazingly fortunate, such a situation, I suppose, as no young woman before ever met with on first going out. Do not think us ungrateful, Miss Woodhouse, for such surprising good fortune," again dispersing her tears. "But poor dear soul, if you were to see what a headache she has. When one is in great pain, you know one cannot feel any blessing quite as it deserves. She is as low as possible. To look at her, nobody would think how delighted and happy she is to have secured such a situation. You will excuse her not coming to you. She is not able. She has gone into her own room. I want her to lie down upon the bed." "My dear," said I shall say you are laid down upon the bed. But, however, she is not. She is walking about the room. But, now that she has written her letters, she says she shall soon be well. She will be extremely sorry to miss seeing you, Miss Woodhouse, but your kindness will excuse her. You were kept waiting at the door. I was quite ashamed, but somehow there was a little bustle, for it so happened that we had not heard the knock. Until you were on the stairs, we did not know anybody was coming. 'It is only Mrs. Cole,' said I. 'Depend upon it, nobody else would come so early.' 'Well,' said she, 'it must be born some time or other, and it may as well be now.' But then Patty came in and said it was you. 'Oh,' said I, 'it is Miss Woodhouse. I am sure you will like to see her.' 'I can see nobody,' said she, and up she got and would go away, and that was what made us keep you waiting, and extremely sorry and ashamed we were. 'If you must go, my dear,' said I, 'you must, and I will say you are laid down upon the bed.'" Emma was most sincerely interested. Her heart had been long growing kinder towards Jane, and this picture of her present sufferings acted as a cure of every former ungenerous suspicion, and left her nothing but pity, and the remembrance of the less just and less gentle sensations of the past obliged her to admit that Jane might very naturally reserve on seeing Mrs. Cole or any other steady friend, when she might not bear to see herself. She spoke as she felt, with earnest regret and solicitude, sincerely wishing that the circumstances which she collected from Miss Bates to be now actually determined on might be as much for Miss Fairfax's advantage and comfort as possible. It must be a severe trial to them all. She had understood it was to be delayed till Colonel Campbell's return. "So very kind," replied Miss Bates, "but you are always kind." There was no bearing such an always, and to break through her dreadful gratitude, Emma made the direct inquiry of, "Where, may I ask, is Miss Fairfax going?" "To a Mrs. Smallridge, charming woman, most superior, to have the charge of her 3 little girls. Delightful children. Impossible that any situation could be more replete with comfort, if we except, perhaps, Mrs. Suckling's own family and Mrs. Bragg's. But Mrs. Smallridge is intimate with both, and in the very same neighborhood, lives only 4 miles from Maple Grove. Jane will be only 4 miles from Maple Grove." "Mrs. Elton, I suppose, has been the person to whom Miss Fairfax owes—" "Yes, our good Mrs. Elton, the most indefatigable, true friend. She would not take a denial. She would not let Jane say no, for when Jane first heard of it, it was the day before yesterday, the very morning we were at Donwell. When Jane first heard of it, she was quite decided against accepting the offer, and for the reasons you mention, exactly as you say, she had made up her mind to close with nothing till Colonel Campbell's return, and nothing should induce her to enter into any engagement at present, and so she told Mrs. Elton over and over again. and I am sure I had no more idea that she would change her mind. But that good Mrs. Elton, whose judgment never fails her, saw farther than I did. It is not everybody that would have stood out in such a kind way as she did and refused to take Jane's answer. But she positively declared she would not write any such denial yesterday as Jane wished her. She would wait, and sure enough, yesterday evening it was all settled that Jane should go. Quite a surprise to me. I had not the least idea. Jane took Mrs. Elton aside and told her at once that upon thinking over the advantages of Mrs. Smallridge's situation, she had come to the resolution of accepting it. I did not know a word of it till it was all settled. You spent the evening with Mrs. Elton? Yes, all of us. Mrs. Elton would have us come. It was settled so upon the hill while we were walking about with Mr. Knightley. You must all spend your evening with us, said she. I positively must have you all come. Mr. Knightley was there too, was he? No, not Mr. Knightley. He declined it from the first, and though I thought he would come, because Mrs. Elton declared she would not let him off, he did not. But my mother and Jane and I were all there, and a very agreeable evening we had. Such kind friends, you know, Miss Woodhouse, one must always find agreeable, though everybody seemed rather fagged after the morning's party. Even pleasure, you know, is fatiguing, and I cannot say that any of them seemed very much to have enjoyed it. However, I shall always think it a very pleasant party, and feel extremely obliged to the kind friends who included me in it. Miss Fairfax, I suppose, though you were not aware of it, had been making up her mind the whole day. I dare say she had. Whenever the time may come, it must be unwelcome to her and all her friends, but I hope her engagement will have every alleviation that is possible. I mean as to the character and manners of the family. Thank you, dear Miss Woodhouse. Yes, indeed, there is everything in the world that can make her happy in it. Except the Sucklings and Braggs, there is not such another nursery establishment so liberal and elegant in all Mrs. Elton's acquaintance. Mrs. Smallridge, a most delightful woman, a style of living almost equal to Maple Grove, and as to the children, except the little Sucklings and little Braggs, there are not such elegant, sweet children anywhere. Jane will be treated with such regard and kindness. It will be nothing but pleasure, a life of pleasure, and her salary! I really cannot venture to name her salary to you, Miss Woodhouse. Even you, used as you are to great sums, would hardly believe that so much could be given to a young person like Jane. Ah, madam, cried Emma, if other children are at all like what I remember to have been myself, I should think 5 times the amount of what I have ever yet heard named as a salary on such occasions, dearly earned. You are so noble in your ideas. And when is Miss Fairfax to leave you? Very soon indeed. That's the worst of it. Within a fortnight. Mrs. Smallridge is in a great hurry. My poor mother does not know how to bear it. So then I try to put it out of her thoughts and say, come, ma'am, do not let us think about it any more. Her friends must all be sorry to lose her, and will not Colonel and Mrs. Campbell be sorry to find that she has engaged herself before their return? Yes, Jane says she is sure they will, but yet this is such a situation as she cannot feel herself justified in declining. I was so astonished when she first told me what she had been saying to Mrs. Elton, and when Mrs. Elton at the same moment came congratulating me upon it. It was before tea. Stay. No, it could not be before tea, because we were just going to cards. And yet it was before tea, because I remember thinking, oh, now I recollect, now I have it. Something happened before tea, but not that. Mr. Elton was called out of the room before tea. Old John Abdy's son wanted to speak with him. Poor old John, I have a great regard for him. He was a clerk to my poor father 27 years, and now, poor old man, he is bedridden and very poorly with the rheumatic gout in his joints. I must go and see him today, and so will Jane, I am sure, if she gets out at all. And poor John's son came to talk to Mr. Elton about relief from the parish. He is very well to do himself, you know, being head man at the Crown, ostler, and everything of that sort, but still he cannot keep his father without some help. And so when Mr. Elton came back, he told us what John Ostler had been telling him, and then it came out about the chaise having been sent to Randall's to take Mr. Frank Churchill to Richmond. That was what happened before tea. It was after tea that Jane spoke to Mrs. Elton. Miss Bates would hardly give Emma time to say how perfectly new this circumstance was to her, but as without supposing it possible that she could be ignorant of any of the particulars of Mr. Frank Churchill's going, she proceeded to give them all. It was of no consequence. What Mr. Elton had learnt from the ostler on this subject, being the accumulation of the ostler's own knowledge and the knowledge of the servants at Randall's, was that a messenger had come over from Richmond soon after the return of the party from Box Hill, which messenger, however, had been no more than was expected, and that Mr. Churchill had sent his nephew a few lines, containing upon the whole a tolerable account of Mrs. Churchill, and only wishing him not to delay coming back beyond the next morning early, but that Mr. Frank Churchill, having resolved to go home directly, without waiting at all, and his horse seemed to have got a cold, Tom had been sent off immediately for the Crown chaise, and the ostler had stood out and seen it pass by, the boy going a good pace, and driving very steady. There was nothing in all this either to astonish or interest, and it caught Emma's attention only as it united with the subject which already engaged her mind. The contrast between Mrs. Churchill's importance in the world and Jane Fairfax's struck her. One was everything, the other nothing, and she sat musing on the difference of woman's destiny, and quite unconscious on what her eyes were fixed, till roused by Miss Bates's saying, "Aye, I see what you are thinking of, the pianoforte. What is to become of it? Very true. Poor dear Jane was talking of it just now. You must go," said she. "You and I must part. You will have no business here. Let it stay, however," said she. "Give it house room till Colonel Campbell comes back. I shall talk about it to him. He will settle for me. He will help me out of all my difficulties." And to this day I do believe she knows not whether it was his present or his daughter's. Now Emma was obliged to think of the pianoforte, and the remembrance of all her former fanciful and unfair conjectures was so little pleasing that she soon allowed herself to believe her visit had been long enough, and with the repetition of everything that she could venture to say of the good wishes which she really felt, took leave. And now chapter 9 of volume 3, or chapter 45 of Emma. Emma's pensive meditations as she walked home were not interrupted, but on entering the parlor she found those who must rouse her. Mr. Knightley and Harriet had arrived during her absence and were sitting with her father. Mr. Knightley immediately got up and in a manner decidedly graver than usual said, "I would not go away without seeing you, but I have no time to spare, and therefore must now be gone directly. I am going to London to spend a few days with John and Isabella. Have you anything to send or say besides the love which nobody carries?" "Nothing at all. But is not this a sudden scheme?" "Yes, rather. I have been thinking of it some little time." Emma was sure he had not forgiven her. He looked unlike himself. Time, however, she thought, would tell him that they ought to be friends again. While he stood, as if meaning to go, but not going, her father began his inquiries. "Well, my dear, and did you get there safely? And how did you find my worthy old friend and her daughter? I dare say they must have been very much obliged to you for coming. Dear Emma has been to call on Mrs. and Miss Bates, Mr. Knightley, as I told you before. She is always so attentive to them." Emma's color was heightened by this unjust praise, and with a smile and shake of the head, which spoke much, she looked at Mr. Knightley. It seemed as if there were an instantaneous impression in her favor, as if his eyes received the truth from hers, and all that had passed of good in her feelings were at once caught and honored. He looked at her with a glow of regard. She was warmly gratified, and in another moment still more so, by a little movement of more than common friendliness on his part. He took her hand. Whether she had not herself made the first motion, she could not say. She might perhaps have rather offered it, but he took her hand, pressed it, and certainly was on the point of carrying it to his lips, when from some fancy or other he suddenly let it go. Why he should feel such a scruple, why he should change his mind when it was all but done, she could not perceive. He would have judged better, she thought, if he had not stopped. The intention, however, was indubitable, and whether it was that his manners had in general so little gallantry, or however else it happened, but she thought nothing became him more. It was with him, of so simple yet so dignified a nature. She could not but recall the attempt with great satisfaction. It spoke such perfect amity. He left them immediately afterwards, gone in a moment. He always moved with the alertness of a mind which could neither be undecided nor dilatory, but now he seemed more sudden than usual in his disappearance. Emma could not regret her having gone to Miss Bates, but she wished she had left her 10 minutes earlier. It would have been a great pleasure to talk over Jane Fairfax's situation with Mr. Knightley. Neither would she regret that he should be going to Brunswick Square, for she knew how much his visit would be enjoyed, but it might have happened at a better time, and to have had longer notice of it would have been pleasanter. They parted thorough friends, however. She could not be deceived as to the meaning of his countenance and his unfinished gallantry. It was all done to assure her that she had fully recovered his good opinion. He had been sitting with them half an hour, she found. It was a pity that she had not come back earlier. In the hope of diverting her father's thoughts from the disagreeableness of Mr. Knightley's going to London, and going so suddenly, and going on horseback, which she knew would be all very bad, Emma communicated her news of Jane Fairfax, and her dependence on the effect was justified. It supplied a very useful check, interested without disturbing him. He had long made up his mind to Jane Fairfax's going out as a governess, and could talk of it cheerfully. But Mr. Knightley's going to London had been an unexpected blow. I am very glad indeed, my dear, to hear she is to be so comfortably settled. Mrs. Elton is very good-natured and agreeable, and I dare say her acquaintance are just what they ought to be. I hope it is a dry situation, and that her health will be taken good care of. It ought to be a first object, as I am sure poor Miss Taylor's always was with me. You know, my dear, she is going to be to this new lady what Miss Taylor was to us, and I hope she will be better off in one respect, and not be induced to go away after it has been her home so long. The following day brought news from Richmond to throw everything else into the background. An express arrived at Randalls to announce the death of Mrs. Churchill. Though her nephew had had no particular reason to hasten back on her account, she had not lived above 36 hours after his return. A sudden seizure of a different nature from anything foreboded by her general state had carried her off after a short struggle. The great Mrs. Churchill was no more. It was felt as such things must be felt. Everybody had a degree of gravity and sorrow, tenderness towards the departed, solicitude for the surviving friends, and, in a reasonable time, curiosity to know where she would be buried. Goldsmith tells us that when lovely woman stoops to folly, she has nothing to do but die, and when she stoops to be disagreeable, it is equally to be recommended as a clearer of ill fame. Mrs. Churchill, after being disliked at least 25 years, was now spoken of with compassionate allowances. In one point she was fully justified. She had never been admitted before to be seriously ill. The event acquitted her of all the fancifulness and all the selfishness of imaginary complaints. Poor Mrs. Churchill! No doubt she had been suffering a great deal, more than anybody had ever supposed, and continual pain would try the temper. It was a sad event, a great shock. With all her faults, what would Mr. Churchill do without her? Mr. Churchill's loss would be dreadful indeed. Mr. Churchill would never get over it. Even Mr. Weston shook his head and looked solemn and said, "Ah, poor woman, who would have thought it?" and resolved that his mourning should be as handsome as possible, and his wife sat sighing and moralizing over her broad hems with a commiseration and good sense, true and steady. How it would affect Frank was among the earliest thoughts of both. It was also a very early speculation with Emma. The character of Mrs. Churchill, the grief of her husband, her mind glanced over them both with awe and compassion, and then rested with lightened feelings on how Frank might be affected by the event, how benefited, how freed. She saw in a moment all the possible good. Now an attachment to Harriet Smith would have nothing to encounter. Mr. Churchill, independent of his wife, was feared by nobody, an easy, guidable man, to be persuaded into anything by his nephew. All that remained to be wished was that the nephew should form the attachment, as, with all her goodwill in the cause, Emma could find no certainty of its being already formed. Harriet behaved extremely well on the occasion, with great self-command. Whatever she might feel of brighter hope, she betrayed nothing. Emma was gratified to observe such a proof in her of strengthened character, and refrained from any allusion that might endanger its maintenance. They spoke, therefore, of Mrs. Churchill's death, with mutual forbearance. Short letters from Frank were received at Randall's, communicating all that was immediately important of their state and plans. Mr. Churchill was better than could be expected, and their first removal, on the departure of the funeral for Yorkshire, was to be to the house of a very old friend in Windsor, to whom Mr. Churchill had been promising a visit in the last 10 years. At present, there was nothing to be done for Harriet. Good wishes for the future were all that could yet be possible on Emma's side. Yet it was a more pressing concern to show attention to Jane Fairfax, whose prospects were closing while Harriet's opened, and whose engagements now allowed of no delay in anyone at Highbury who wished to show her kindness. And with Emma, it was grown into a first wish. She had scarcely a stronger regret than for her past coldness, and the person whom she had been so many months neglecting was now the very one on whom she would have lavished every distinction of regard or sympathy. She wanted to be of use to her, wanted to show a value for her society, and testify respect and consideration. She resolved to prevail on her to spend a day at Hartfield. A note was written to urge it. The invitation was refused, and by a verbal message. Miss Fairfax was not well enough to write. And when Mr. Perry called at Hartfield the same morning, it appeared that she was so much indisposed as to have been visited, though against her own consent, by himself, and that she was suffering under severe headaches and a nervous fever to a degree which made him doubt the possibility of her going to Mrs. Smallridge's at the time proposed. Her health seemed for the moment completely deranged, appetite quite gone, and though there were no absolutely alarming symptoms, nothing touching the pulmonary complaint, which was the standing apprehension of the family, Mr. Perry was uneasy about her. He thought she had undertaken more than she was equal to, and that she felt it so herself, though she would not own it. Her spirits seemed overcome. Her present home, he could not but observe, was unfavorable to a nervous disorder, confined always to one room. He could have wished it otherwise, and her good aunt, though his very old friend, he must acknowledge to be not the best companion for an invalid of that description. Her care and attention could not be questioned. They were, in fact, only too great. He very much feared that Miss Fairfax derived more evil than good from them. Emma listened with the warmest concern, grieved for her more and more, and looked around eager to discover some way of being useful. To take her, be it only an hour or two, from her aunt, to give her change of air and scene, and quiet rational conversation, even for an hour or two, might do her good. And the following morning she wrote again to say, in the most feeling language she could command, that she would call for her in the carriage at any hour that Jane would name, mentioning that she had Mr. Perry's decided opinion in favor of such exercise for his patient. The answer was only in this short note: Miss Fairfax's compliments and thanks, but is quite unequal to any exercise. Emma felt that her own note had deserved something better, but it was impossible to quarrel with words whose tremulous inequality showed indisposition so plainly, and she thought only of how she might best counteract this unwillingness to be seen or assisted. In spite of the answer, therefore, she ordered the carriage and drove to Mrs. Bates's, in the hope that Jane would be induced to join her. But it would not do. Miss Bates came to the carriage door, all gratitude, and agreeing with her most earnestly in thinking an airing might be of the greatest service, and everything that message could do was tried, but all in vain. Miss Bates was obliged to return without success. Jane was quite unpersuadable. The mere proposal of going out seemed to make her worse. Emma wished she could have seen her and tried her own powers, but almost before she could hint the wish, Miss Bates made it appear that she had promised her niece on no account to let Miss Woodhouse in. Indeed, the truth was that poor dear Jane could not bear to see anybody at all. Miss Elton indeed could not be denied, and Mrs. Cole had made such a point, and Mrs. Perry had said so much, but except them, Jane would really see nobody. Emma did not want to be classed with the Mrs. Eltons, the Mrs. Perrys, and the Mrs. Coles, who had forced themselves anywhere. Neither could she feel any right of preference herself. She submitted, therefore, and only questioned Miss Bates further as to her niece's appetite and diet, which she longed to be able to assist. On that subject, poor Miss Bates was very unhappy and very communicative. Jane could hardly eat anything. Mr. Perry recommended nourishing food, but everything they could command, and never had anybody such good neighbors, was distasteful. Emma, on reaching home, called the housekeeper directly to an examination of her stores, and some arrowroot of very superior quality was speedily dispatched to Miss Bates with a most friendly note. In half an hour the arrowroot was returned with 1,000 thanks from Miss Bates, but dear Jane would not be satisfied without its being sent back. It was a thing she could not take, and moreover, she insisted on her saying that she was not at all in want of anything. When Emma afterwards heard that Jane Fairfax had been seen wandering about the meadows at some distance from Highbury on the afternoon of the very day on which she had, under the plea of being unequal to any exercise, so peremptorily refused to go out with her in the carriage, she could have no doubt, putting everything together, that Jane was resolved to receive no kindness from her. She was sorry, very sorry. Her heart was grieved for a state which seemed but the more pitiable from this sort of irritation of spirits, inconsistency of action, and inequality of powers, and it mortified her that she had given so little credit for proper feeling, or esteemed so little worthy as a friend. But she had the consolation of knowing that her intentions were good, and of being able to say to herself that could Mr. Knightley have been privy to all her attempts of assisting Jane Fairfax, could he even have seen into her heart, he would not, on this occasion, have found anything to reprove. And finally, chapter 46 of Emma, or chapter 10 of volume 3. One morning, about 10 days after Mrs. Churchill's decease, Emma was called downstairs to Mr. Weston, who could not stay 5 minutes and wanted particularly to speak with her. He met her at the parlor door, and hardly asking her how she did, in the natural key of his voice, sunk it immediately to say, unheard by her father, "Can you come to Randalls at any time this morning? Do, if it be possible. Mrs. Weston wants to see you. She must see you." "Is she unwell?" No, not at all. Only a little agitated. She would have ordered the carriage and come to you, but she must see you alone. And that, you know," nodding towards her father, "humph. Can you come?" "Certainly. This moment, if you please. It is impossible to refuse what you ask in such a way. But what can be the matter? Is she really not ill?" "Depend upon me. But ask no more questions. You will know it all in time. The most unaccountable business. But hush, hush." To guess what all this meant was impossible even for Emma. Something really important seemed announced by his looks, but as her friend was well, she endeavored not to be uneasy, and settling it with her father that she would take her walk now, she and Mr. Weston were soon out of the house together and on their way at a quick pace for Randalls. "Now," said Emma, when they were fairly beyond the sweep gates, "now, Mr. Weston, do let me know what has happened." No, he gravely replied. "Don't ask me. I promised my wife to leave it all to her. She will break it to you better than I can. Do not be impatient, Emma. It will all come out too soon." "Break it to me?" cried Emma, standing still with terror. "Good God! Mr. Weston, tell me at once. Something has happened in Brunswick Square. I know it has. Tell me, I charge you, tell me this moment what it is." "No, indeed, you are mistaken. Mr. Weston, do not trifle with me. Consider how many of my dearest friends are now in Brunswick Square. Which of them is it? I charge you, by all that is sacred, not to attempt concealment." "Upon my word, Emma." "Your word? Why not your honor? Why not say upon your honor that it has nothing to do with any of them? Good heavens, what can be to be broke to me that does not relate to one of that family?" "Upon my honor," said he very seriously, "it does not. It is not in the smallest degree connected with any human being of the name of Knightley." Emma's courage returned, and she walked on. "I was wrong," he continued, "in talking of its being broke to you. I should not have used the expression. In fact, it does not concern you. It concerns only myself. That is, we hope." "Umph." In short, my dear Emma, there is no occasion to be so uneasy about it. I don't say that it is not a disagreeable business, but things might be much worse. If we walk fast, we shall soon be at Randall's." Emma found that she must wait, and now it required little effort. She asked no more questions, therefore, merely employed her own fancy, and that soon pointed out to her the probability of its being some money concern, something just come to light of a disagreeable nature in the circumstances of the family, something which the late event at Richmond had brought forward. Her fancy was very active. 6 natural children, perhaps, and poor Frank cut off. This, though very undesirable, would be no matter of agony to her. It inspired little more than an animating curiosity. "Who is that gentleman on horseback?" said she, as they proceeded, speaking more to assist Mr. Weston in keeping the secret than with any other view. "I do not know. One of the Otways. Not Frank. It is not Frank, I assure you. You will not see him. He is halfway to Windsor by this time." "Oh, has your son been with you then?" "Oh, yes. Did not you know? Well, never mind." For a moment he was silent, and then added, in a tone much more guarded and demure, "Yes, Frank came over this morning, just to ask how we did." They hurried on, and were speedily at Randall's. "Well, my dear," said he as they entered the room, "I have brought her, and now I hope you will soon be better. I shall leave you together. There is no use in delay. I shall not be far off if you want me." And Emma distinctly heard him add in a lower tone before he quitted the room, "I have been as good as my word. She has not the least idea." Mrs. Weston was looking so ill and had an air of so much perturbation that Emma's uneasiness increased, and the moment they were alone she eagerly said, "What is it, my dear friend? Something of a very unpleasant nature, I find, has occurred. Do let me know directly what it is. I have been walking all this way in complete suspense. We both abhor suspense. Do not let mine continue longer. It will do you good to speak of your distress, whatever it may be." "Have you indeed no idea?" said Mrs. Weston in a trembling voice. "Cannot you, my dear Emma, cannot you form a guess as to what you are to hear?" "So far as that it relates to Mr. Frank Churchill, I do guess." "You are right. It does relate to him, and I will tell you directly," resuming her work and seeming resolved against looking up. "He has been here this very morning on a most extraordinary errand. It is impossible to express our surprise. He came to speak to his father on a subject, to announce an attachment." She stopped to breathe. Emma thought first of herself and then of Harriet. "More than an attachment, indeed," resumed Mrs. Weston. "An engagement, a positive engagement. What will you say, Emma? What will anybody say when it is known that Frank Churchill and Miss Fairfax are engaged? Nay, that they have been long engaged." Emma even jumped with surprise, and, horror-struck, exclaimed, "Jane Fairfax! Good God! You are not serious? You do not mean it?" "You may well be amazed," returned Mrs. Weston, still averting her eyes and talking on with eagerness that Emma might have time to recover. "You may well be amazed, but it is even so. There has been a solemn engagement between them ever since October, formed at Weymouth and kept a secret from everybody. Not a creature knowing it but themselves, neither the Campbells, nor her family, nor his. It is so wonderful that though perfectly convinced of the fact, it is yet almost incredible to myself. I could hardly believe it. I thought I knew him." Emma scarcely heard what was said. Her mind was divided between two ideas, her own former conversations with him about Miss Fairfax, and poor Harriet. And for some time she could only exclaim and require confirmation, repeated confirmation. "Well," said she at last, trying to recover herself, "this is a circumstance which I must think of at least half a day, before I can at all comprehend it." "What? Engaged to her all the winter, before either of them came to Highbury?" "Engaged since October, secretly engaged. It has hurt me, Emma, very much. It has hurt his father equally. Some part of his conduct we cannot excuse." Emma pondered a moment and then replied, "I will not pretend not to understand you. And to give you all the relief in my power, be assured that no such effect has followed his attentions to me as you are apprehensive of. Mrs. Weston looked up, afraid to believe, but Emma's countenance was as steady as her words. That you may have less difficulty in believing this boast of my present perfect indifference, she continued, I will farther tell you that there was a period in the very early part of our acquaintance when I did like him, when I was very much disposed to be attached to him, nay, was attached, and how it came to cease is perhaps the wonder. Fortunately, however, it did cease. I have really for some time past, for at least these 3 months, cared nothing about him. You may believe me, Mrs. Weston. This is the simple truth. Mrs. Weston kissed her with tears of joy, and when she could find utterance, assured her that this protestation had done her more good than anything else in the world could do. Mr. Weston will be almost as much relieved as myself, said she. On this point we have been wretched. It was our darling wish that you might be attached to each other, and we were persuaded that it was so. Imagine what we have been feeling on your account. I have escaped, and that I should escape may be a matter of grateful wonder to you and myself. But this does not acquit him, Mrs. Weston, and I must say that I think him greatly to blame. What right had he to come among us with affection and faith engaged, and with manners so very disengaged? What right had he to endeavor to please, as he certainly did, to distinguish any one young woman with persevering attention, as he certainly did, while he really belonged to another? How could he tell what mischief he might be doing? How could he tell that he might not be making me in love with him? Very wrong indeed. From something that he said, my dear Emma, I rather imagine. And how could she bear such behavior? Composure with a witness, to look on while repeated attentions were offering to another woman before her face, and not resent it. That is a degree of placidity which I can neither comprehend nor respect. There were misunderstandings between them, Emma, he said so expressly. He had not time to enter into much explanation. He was here only a quarter of an hour, and in a state of agitation which did not allow the full use even of the time he could stay. But that there had been misunderstandings, he decidedly said. The present crisis, indeed, seemed to be brought on by them, and those misunderstandings might very possibly arise from the impropriety of his conduct. Impropriety? Oh, Mrs. Weston, it is too calm a censure. Much, much beyond impropriety. It has sunk him. I cannot say how it has sunk him in my opinion. So unlike what a man should be. None of that upright integrity, that strict adherence to truth and principle, that disdain of trick and littleness which a man should display in every transaction of his life. Nay, dear Emma, now I must take his part, for though he has been wrong in this instance, I have known him long enough to answer for his having many, very many good qualities, and— Good God, cried Emma, not attending to her. Mrs. Smallridge, too! Jane actually on the point of going as governess! What could he mean by such horrible indelicacy? To suffer her to engage herself, to suffer her even to think of such a measure. He knew nothing about it, Emma. On this article I can fully acquit him. It was a private resolution of hers, not communicated to him, or at least not communicated in a way to carry conviction. Till yesterday I know he said he was in the dark as to her plans. They burst on him, I do not know how, but by some letter or message, and it was the discovery of what she was doing, of this very project of hers, which determined him to come forward at once, own it all to his uncle, throw himself on his kindness, and in short, put an end to the miserable state of concealment that had been carrying on so long. Emma began to listen better. I am to hear from him soon, continued Mrs. Weston. He told me at parting that he should soon write, and he spoke in a manner which seemed to promise me many particulars that could not be given now. Let us wait, therefore, for this letter. It may bring many extenuations. It may make many things intelligible and excusable which now are not to be understood. Don't let us be severe. Don't let us be in a hurry to condemn him. Let us have patience. I must love him, and now that I am satisfied on one point, the one material point, I am sincerely anxious for its all turning out well, and ready to hope that it may. They must both have suffered a great deal under such a system of secrecy and concealment. His sufferings, replied Emma dryly, do not appear to have done him much harm. Well, and how did Mr. Churchill take it? Most favorably for his nephew, gave his consent with scarcely a difficulty. Conceive what the events of a week have done in that family. While poor Mrs. Churchill lived, I suppose there could not have been a hope, a chance, a possibility. But scarcely are her remains at rest in the family vault, than her husband is persuaded to act exactly opposite to what she would have required. What a blessing it is when undue influence does not survive the grave. He gave his consent with very little persuasion. Ah, thought Emma, he would have done as much for Harriet. This was settled last night, and Frank was off with the light this morning. He stopped at Highbury, at the Bateses, I fancy, some time, and then came on hither, but was in such a hurry to get back to his uncle, to whom he is just now more necessary than ever, that, as I tell you, he could stay with us but a quarter of an hour. He was very much agitated, very much indeed, to a degree that made him appear quite a different creature from anything I had ever seen him before. In addition to all the rest, there had been the shock of finding her so very unwell, which he had had no previous suspicion of, and there was every appearance of his having been feeling a great deal. And do you really believe the affair to have been carrying on with such perfect secrecy? The Campbells, the Dixons, did none of them know of the engagement? Emma could not speak the name of Dixon without a little blush. None, not one. He positively said that it had been known to no being in the world but their two selves. Well, said Emma, I suppose we shall gradually grow reconciled to the idea, and I wish them very happy. But I shall always think it a very abominable sort of proceeding. What has it been but a system of hypocrisy and deceit, espionage and treachery, to come amongst us with professions of openness and simplicity, and such a league in secret to judge us all? Here have we been, the whole winter and spring, completely duped, fancying ourselves all on an equal footing of truth and honor, with two people in the midst of us who may have been carrying round, comparing and sitting in judgment on sentiments and words that were never meant for both to hear. They must take the consequence if they have heard each other spoken of in a way not perfectly agreeable. I am quite easy on that head, replied Mrs. Weston. I am very sure that I never said anything of either to the other, which both might not have heard. You are in luck. Your only blunder was confined to my ear, when you imagined a certain friend of ours in love with the lady. True, but as I have always had a thoroughly good opinion of Miss Fairfax, I never could, under any blunder, have spoken ill of her, and as to speaking ill of him, there I must have been safe. At this moment, Mr. Weston appeared at a little distance from the window, evidently on the watch. His wife gave him a look which invited him in, and while he was coming round, added, Now, dearest Emma, let me entreat you to say and look everything that may set his heart at ease, and incline him to be satisfied with the match. Let us make the best of it, and indeed, almost everything may be fairly said in her favor. It is not a connection to gratify, but if Mr. Churchill does not feel that, why should we? And it may be a very fortunate circumstance for him, for Frank, I mean, that he should have attached himself to a girl of such steadiness of character and good judgment as I have always given her credit for, and still am disposed to give her credit for, in spite of this one great deviation from the strict rule of right. And how much may be said in her situation for even that error? Much indeed, cried Emma feelingly. If a woman can ever be excused for thinking only of herself, it is a situation like Jane Fairfax's. Of such, one may almost say that the world is not theirs, nor the world's law. She met Mr. Weston on his entrance with a smiling countenance, exclaiming, A very pretty trick you have been playing me, upon my word. This was a device, I suppose, to sport with my curiosity and exercise my talent for guessing. But you really frightened me. I thought you had lost half your property, at least. And here, instead of its being a matter of condolence, it turns out to be one of congratulation. I congratulate you, Mr. Weston, with all my heart, on the prospect of having one of the most lovely and accomplished young women in England for your daughter. A glance or two between him and his wife convinced him that all was as right as this speech proclaimed, and its happy effect on his spirits was immediate. His air and voice recovered their usual briskness. He shook her heartily and gratefully by the hand, and entered on the subject in a manner to prove that he now only wanted time and persuasion to think the engagement no very bad thing. His companion suggested only what could palliate imprudence or smooth objections, and by the time they had talked it all over together, and he had talked it all over again with Emma in their walk back to Hartfield, he was become perfectly reconciled, and not far from thinking it the very best thing that Frank could possibly have done. That concludes our reading today. We have just one more week of reading, and now we know that Mr. Frank Churchill was engaged to Jane Fairfax this whole time. And so all those times when Emma was sort of teasing about Jane Fairfax, or mentioning that she thought that Jane Fairfax had some romance with Mr. Dixon, or if not a romance with him, at least had feelings for him, we know that Frank Churchill was teasing, was laughing about it the whole time, knowing that he was the one who had engaged Miss Fairfax's affections. And so thank you very much for joining me today. We have had a big reveal, but we'll see what has to come next week. There's more. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me again. I hope you can go online if you have not yet to vote on what books you would like to read next. And I will see you next week. Take care. Thank you. Bye.